Imagine ruling the most powerful empire on earth, commanding armies that could crush entire nations, and still losing sleep over a group of unarmed men. In 93 AD, Emperor Domitian controlled Rome with absolute authority. His word was law. His enemies vanished without a trace. Fear wasn't just a tool of his rule, it was the foundation of it. And yet, there was one thing he could not control. Not an army, not a rebellion, not a political rival, a philosophy. A group of men who owned nothing, feared nothing, and refused to lie. Here at Stoic Lighthouse, we don't chase quick fixes or empty promises. We look for clarity, direction, and inner calm in a world that constantly tries to shake us. What terrified the most powerful man in the world was the simple idea that truth cannot be forced, and a mind cannot be conquered without consent. So he made a decision that would echo through history. He tried to erase philosophy itself. Number 1. The tyrant's weakness. Why truth breaks power. To understand why Domitian was afraid, you first need to understand how a tyrant actually survives, not through strength alone, but through perception. A tyrant rules by controlling what people believe matters. Wealth, status, reputation, safety, life itself, these become the pressure points, the levers of obedience. Take those away, and most people collapse. That's the system. As long as people fear losing what they think is essential, they will comply. They will stay silent. They will justify anything, even injustice. Then the Stoics enter the picture, and the entire structure begins to crack, because a Stoic looks at those same threats and shrugs. Wealth, temporary, status, irrelevant, pain, bearable, death, inevitable. None of these define good or evil. Only one thing does: character. As Epictetus made brutally clear, where is good? In my choices. Where is evil? In my choices. Where is neither? In the things outside my control. This idea is not just philosophical, it is destabilizing, because the moment a person truly accepts this, fear loses its grip. Imagine threatening a man with exile, and he calmly tells you the entire world is his home. Imagine threatening him with death, and he reminds you he was always mortal. What do you take from someone who has already let go of everything? Nothing, and that is exactly the problem. A man who fears nothing cannot be controlled. He breaks the currency of power itself. In Rome, many of these Stoics were not outsiders. They were senators, influential men, visible men, but they refused to play the game. They didn't flatter the emperor. They didn't endorse corruption. They didn't pretend injustice was justice. They simply told the truth. And that quiet refusal became something far more dangerous than open rebellion. Centuries later, Alexander Solzhenitsyn would capture the essence of this kind of resistance with unsettling precision. One word of truth outweighs the entire world. That is what Domitian was facing. Not weapons, not conspiracies, but individuals who could not be bent. Their integrity exposed the fragility of his power. Their silence revealed his noise. Their courage reflected his fear. And that is why they had to go. Number 2, the silent rebellion. Men who refused to kneel. History tends to remember revolutions as loud, violent, and chaotic, but the most dangerous rebellion in Rome was none of those things. It had no army, no banners, no battle cries, only men who refused to cooperate with lies. What historians now call the Stoic opposition was not an organized movement in the traditional sense. There were no secret meetings plotting assassinations, no coordinated uprisings, just individuals bound by something far more difficult to enforce: principle. Men like Epictetus, Helvidius Priscus, and Rusticus became legendary, not because of what they did, but because of what they refused to do. When emperors demanded applause for cruelty, they remained silent. When corruption was presented as policy, they voted against it, and they did this fully aware of the cost. Exile, ruin, death. This was not recklessness, it was clarity. They understood something most people avoid facing, that survival without integrity is a slow form of self-destruction. Their resistance was built on two unshakable pillars: justice and courage. Justice meant they would not participate in wrongdoing. Courage meant they would accept the consequences without complaint. Epictetus preserved one of the most striking moments of this quiet defiance, a confrontation between Emperor Vespasian and the Stoic senator Helvidius Priscus. The emperor ordered him not to attend the Senate, or if he did, to remain silent. Helvidius responded without hesitation, "It is in your power to forbid me from being a senator, but as long as I am one, I must attend, and if I attend, I must speak what I believe is right." Then he added the line that removed all leverage, "When did I ever tell you that I was immortal?" That is the moment power collapses, because intimidation only works when the person being threatened is still trying to preserve something at any cost. Helvidius had already made his decision: truth over survival. And that made him untouchable in the only way that mattered. Hannah Arendt, one of the most important political thinkers of the modern era, identified this exact dynamic while studying totalitarian regimes. The greatest threat to any system of control is the individual who continues to think for himself. That is what Rome was facing. Not rebels, but thinkers. Men who could not be programmed by fear. Their existence alone exposed the moral emptiness of the system around them. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need to fight. They simply refused to kneel. And in doing so, they revealed something terrifying to those in power. Control is an illusion the moment people stop believing in it. If this way of seeing life is resonating with you, it's because you're not just looking for answers. You're trying to live with awareness. This channel exists for exactly that reason. Number 3, exile as power. How Epictetus turned loss into freedom. When Domitian issued his final decree, it wasn't symbolic, it was absolute. Every philosopher was ordered to leave Rome and all of Italy. Refusal meant death. To the average Roman, exile was a living death. It meant losing your home, your identity, your influence, your place in society. It meant disappearing. But Epictetus was not an average Roman. He had already endured slavery, torture, physical disability, poverty. So when the most powerful man in the world tried to take his home, it didn't land the way it was supposed to. Because to a Stoic, location is not identity, it's just circumstance. And circumstance has no authority over character. Epictetus didn't resist the exile. He didn't beg. He didn't collapse. He reframed it. As he taught with unmistakable clarity, "They can banish me from Rome, but they cannot banish me from the universe." That single idea destroys the entire premise of punishment, because punishment only works if the person believes something essential has been taken from them. Epictetus didn't. Where others saw loss, he saw movement. Where others saw humiliation, he saw freedom. This is the essence of what modern Stoic philosopher William B. Irvine calls a powerful psychological shift. The ability to reinterpret events in a way that protects your inner stability. Not denial, not delusion, but disciplined perception. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the Stoic asks, "How can I use this?" So Epictetus left Rome, not as a victim, but as a man who refused to carry the meaning that others tried to impose on his circumstances. He traveled to Nicopolis in Greece, and there, something unexpected happened. What was meant to silence him, amplified him. In Nicopolis, Epictetus founded a school. Students came from across the empire, politicians, soldiers, thinkers, future leaders, including the man who would later become Marcus Aurelios. Free from the political pressure of Rome, his teachings spread further than they ever could have at the center of power. Historian Robin Waterfield explains this paradox with striking precision. Persecution did not destroy philosophy, it spread it. What Domitian intended as suppression became distribution. What he meant as punishment became expansion. Because Stoicism, when practiced correctly, has a property most systems don't. It doesn't break under pressure. It adapts, it expands, it strengthens, like fire carried by the wind. Epictetus proves something few people ever truly understand. When you stop resisting reality, you become impossible to defeat. Number 4. Burning books, spreading fire. Why ideas can't be killed. Domitian wasn't satisfied with exile. Removing philosophers from Rome wasn't enough. He wanted to erase them completely. So he escalated. Executions were ordered. Books were burned. Biographies were destroyed in public view. It was an attempt to do something every tyrant eventually tries: control reality itself. If you can destroy the record, silence the voices, and eliminate the thinkers, you can reshape what people believe is true. At least that's the illusion. The Roman historian Tacitus witnessed this moment and captured its arrogance with brutal clarity. They believed that by that fire they could consume the voice of the Roman people, the freedom of the Senate, and the conscience of mankind. But this is where power reveals its limits. You can burn paper, you can silence individuals, you can even rewrite laws, but you cannot destroy an idea whose roots are anchored in truth, because truth does not depend on permission to exist. It reappears again and again, in different voices, in different places, in different generations. Modern thinker Nassim Nicholas Taleb describes this phenomenon with a concept that perfectly fits what happened next. Some things benefit from shocks. They thrive and grow when exposed to volatility, randomness, disorder. He calls it anti-fragility. And Stoicism is one of those things. The more it was attacked, the more visible it became. The more it was suppressed, the more people questioned why. The fire meant to erase it, illuminated it, and then history delivered its verdict. Just 3 years after the exile decree, Domitian was assassinated inside his own palace. Paranoid, isolated, surrounded by enemies he could no longer control. His reign ended in fear, his legacy reduced to a warning. Meanwhile, the ideas he tried to destroy continued to spread quietly across the empire. Epictetus kept teaching. His student Arian preserved his words. Those teachings traveled until they reached a young man in Rome, a boy who would grow up to become emperor, Marcus Aurelios. And in his private writings, the most powerful man in the world acknowledged the very philosophy that had once been banned. From Rusticus, I received the impression that my character needed improvement and discipline, and I was introduced to the discourses of Epictetus. Think about that for a moment. The empire that tried to silence philosophy was now being guided by it. The throne that once feared truth was now shaped by it. This is the final failure of censorship. It doesn't eliminate ideas, it selects them, and the ones that survive pressure are usually the ones worth keeping. Because in the end, power fades, but truth adapts. Number 5. Modern tyranny. Why most people still choose to conform. It's easy to look at ancient Rome and believe this story belongs to the past. An empire, a tyrant, exile, execution. It feels distant, but the structure hasn't changed. Only the tools have. Today, you are not threatened by an emperor. You are threatened by something far more subtle: disapproval, rejection, ridicule, isolation. The modern tyrant doesn't wear a crown. It lives in public opinion, in social media algorithms, in workplace dynamics, in the silent pressure to agree, to comply, to blend in. And just like in Rome, the mechanism is the same: fear of exclusion. If you say the wrong thing, you risk being ignored, attacked, replaced. So most people adapt. They soften their opinions. They hide what they think. They repeat what is safe, not because they believe it, but because they fear the cost of honesty. This is how conformity wins, not through force, but through quiet surrender. The Stoics would recognize this immediately, because the battlefield has always been internal. The real question is not, what are you allowed to say? It's, what are you willing to lose to remain truthful? The Stoic senator Paconius Agrippinus answered that question with a metaphor that still cuts through time. I want to be the purple thread. The small, bright part that gives beauty to the rest of the garment. Why do you ask me to be like the many? If I do, how will I still be the purple? That is the cost. Standing out, not for attention, but for integrity. Modern psychologist Rollo May identified the true danger of our time with unsettling accuracy. The opposite of courage in our society is not cowardice, it is conformity. Because conformity doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like safety. It feels reasonable, practical, even intelligent, until you realize what you traded for it. Your voice, your judgment, your inner authority. This is what the Stoics called the loss of the ruling faculty, the surrender of your ability to think and choose independently. And once that is gone, control becomes effortless, not because someone imposed it, but because you handed it over. The Stoic opposition teaches something uncomfortable but essential. You don't need to fight the system to resist it. You only need to stop lying. Sometimes the most radical act is not speaking louder. It's refusing to say what you know is false. In a world that rewards performance over truth, that choice becomes rare. And that is exactly why it becomes powerful. The inner fortress no one can invade. Domitian is gone. His power, his fear, his control, all of it collapsed under its own weight. But the men he tried to silence are still here, not physically, but through something far more durable than force. Their ideas, their discipline, their refusal to betray themselves. Because in the end, this was never a story about Rome. It was always a story about a choice. The same choice you face today. To conform, or to remain intact, to protect your image, or to protect your character, to stay silent when it's convenient, or to stand firm when it matters. The Stoics made their decision long before they were tested, and that's why, when pressure came, they didn't break. They revealed who they already were. Everything external can be taken from you, but the way you choose to respond is where your true power begins. If this reflection stayed with you, consider subscribing and continuing this journey with our community. Let Stoic Lighthouse guide you toward calm, clarity, and wisdom. In the next video, you'll discover why the people who speak the least often hold the most power, and how mastering silence can completely change the way others perceive you. Remember, the less you need to prove, the more powerful you become. Until the next video.